Good afternoon. I welcome you at the press center of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation at our weekly briefing. We have Russian and foreign media correspondents online. We start with the Minister of Foreign Affairs schedule. On the 31st of May, the head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will take part in the traditional meeting of the Business Council at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The event is planned to comprehensively review the interactions of Russian business community with our BRICS partners. As you know, another very important event is coming at St. Petersburg, and I mean the 27th St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, which will take place from 5th to 8th of June. The northern capital will receive guests from different countries and is one of the largest and most important events in Russia and in the world, which is already holds a reputation for many years. The guest country status this year will be held by Oman and Bolivia. The event will be attended by numerous world leaders, vice presidents, premier ministers, as well as sectoral ministers, public and political figures, heads of the legislative branch of power, international organizations, leading companies, representatives of business, expert, and scientific circles. We expect the participation of representatives of around 130 states. Around 12,000 guests have already signed up. The plenary session, as always, will be opened by the statement of the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. From the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the minister himself, Mr. Lavrov, will take part. There are some bilateral contacts already planned with foreign partners. The agenda is built around the theme, the formation of new areas of growth as the cornerstone of a multipolar world, which is a logical continuation of the last year's discussion. We're building the new multipolar world order. The geopolitical forces are changing due to new polars of influence, due to strengthening sovereignty and opportunities of regional countries, which is why it is especially important to answer the arising challenges, build a constructive dialogue, and build an interaction with responsibility for the future of the world and all the peoples. The main tracks of the business program, which includes over 150 events, there are 4 of them. The first one is the transition to a multipolar world economy. Then, goals and objectives of Russia's new economic cycle, technologies for leadership, and last but not least, a healthy society, traditional values, and social development, the priority of the state. They respond to the key mission of the forum in order to build a multipolar international system. Special attention is paid to the development of international relations and business contact built on the true rights and respect for cultural and civilization multipolarity of states and people. At the thematic sessions, participants will discuss a wide range of issues of global and Russian economy, economic potential of our country under the sanctions regime, transformations of the world energy market, climate agenda, technological sovereign support, social politics, cultural and humanitarian cooperation, and cooperation in the CIS, EU, BRICS, SCO, and ASEAN. Under the context of current geopolitical processes, the theme is especially important, the Greater Eurasian Partnership as a new growth pole, potential and perspectives, which is dedicated to the Russian flagman initiatives to launch the integration of integrations at the continent in order to form a unified space of flourishing and well-being. We're convinced that discussion on this subject will give a strong impulse to the unifying processes in the macro region. Special attention will be dedicated to the themes of saving population, strengthening health, and raising the well-being of people, supporting families, creating possibilities to release the potential of everyone. On the sidelines, there will be business dialogues of Russia, Oman, Russia, Azerbaijan, Russia, Brazil, Russia, Venezuela, Russia, India, Russia, Iran, Russia, Kazakhstan, Russia, China, Russia, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, UAE, Russia, Central Asia, Russia, ASEAN, and Russia, Latin America. There will be a Russian Consultative Forum, Business 20, International Youth Economic Forum, SME Forum, Creative Business Forum, Drug Safety Forum, as well as the exhibition SPIEF Investment and Business Expo. The cultural program of the forum will be very tight. The participants are invited to attend the concerts of classic and pop music, arts exhibitions, movie premieres, exhibitions, and excursions. Anyone who enjoys sports can attend the sports games of the forum. Will include competitions in 18 different kinds of sports. Our next briefing is planned on the sidelines of the St. Petersburg Forum, but I will mention that later on. Now we're moving on to another relevant issue for Russia and for the rest of the world. I would like to say a few words. I would like to speak on the events under the Russia's chairship in BRICS. May 29th and 30th, Russian Academy of Science and SIC Kurchatov Institute is hosting the meeting of BRICS heads of academies of science. The theme is academic partnership in the interests of peace, mutual development, and prosperity. And the subject and the work overall fully reflects the participants' commitment to unify forces in order to solve global issues of the modern development to achieve a better future. This is the goal that the entire cooperation in BRICS is built around. Cooperation of the scientific society of countries who represent different civilizations is aimed at substantive deepening of specialized cooperation to expand scientific research projects, develop the dialogues of young scientists, and popularize science. From June 5th to 10th, Nizhny Novgorod will host the BRICS Skate Cup, which is competitions on skateboarding, push scooter sport, and roller sports among professional athletes in BRICS countries and from the countries who wish to join the BRICS. This sport event will be held in conjunction to the meeting of Ministers of Foreign Affairs of BRICS countries, which will be held in Nizhny Novgorod from 10th to 11th of June 2024. This year, the sports project Grand Skate Tour in Nizhny Novgorod will host together participants from over 20 countries: Azerbaijan, Argentina, Bahrain, Belarus, Brazil, Zimbabwe, Egypt, India, Iran, Kazakhstan, China, Colombia, Cuba, Lebanon, UAE, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Senegal, Thailand, Turkey, Uganda, South African Republic, and Ethiopia. And of course, anyone wishing to participate can do so. Aside from the sports program, the guests can attend several cultural events, movie screenings, and footage of action sports, open lectures with international guests, Russian entrepreneurs, leaders of public opinion in the action sport, culture, urban studies, and park construction spheres. There will also be public filming of sports talk shows, live streams of BRICS Forum activity, and the exhibition of artists and photographers. The organizer of the BRICS Skates Cup is the Russian Federation of Skateboarding, and we invite the representatives of mass media to cover these events. And of course, we will regularly keep you updated on the news of our chairship in BRICS. And now the situation which remains relevant over the years. This is the situation in Ukraine. We would like to start with what the Western countries are doing. On the one hand, they talk about peace in the context of the infamous conference that they're trying to attract everyone to under the pretext of it handling the so-called world building. But this is very far from the truth, and their concrete steps over the last months, over the last years, on supplying arms, the growing financing of the situation in Ukraine, their so-called lack of knowledge of the terrorist attacks of the Kiev regime and their handlers, and so on, only showcase the fact that the collective West are nothing but the world party of war. And the conference planned in Switzerland has nothing to do with peace. It's just another attempt to gather a number of countries to try and legitimize the Western narratives, Western approaches, and of course legitimize not only the figure of Zelensky himself, but also his regime and all the atrocious extremist acts that they have committed. With major failures of Ukrainian armed forces near Kharkov, the Kiev regime is trying to act on its anger and take it out on the Russian civilians, which is subject to the shellings of the NATO arms. And the Western countries are ignoring the terrorist acts of their sponsees, and they encourage them to attack Russian regions. On May 26th, the Minister of Defense of Sweden spoke of this right of the Ukrainian armed forces. On the May 28th, the EU defense ministers meeting, Jens Stoltenberg called on the European capitals to lift any restrictions on the use of the Kiev regime of the Western arms, and the arms that have been supplied to the Kiev regime over some time now speak of the true motives and the plans of the collective West. Because, as everyone perfectly understands, it's not intended to be used in terms of defense. The technical characteristics of these weapons that fall in the hands of the Kiev regime showcase only what they've started talking about openly now, on the encouragement to Zelensky and the Kiev regime to strike the civilian infrastructure in our country. And on May 28th in Berlin, at the meeting with the German Chancellor, Mr. Scholz, the French president used a geographical map of the Russia-Ukraine border, tried to show and argue that, as he said, a direct quote, "We should allow Ukraine to neutralize the military sites on the Russian territory," end of quote. And what does the Washington do? The USA publicly did not agree with the use of American rockets on Russia, but they conduct strikes inside Russia, which is proved by regular attacks on the Crimea. And one of these attacks was conducted on May 24th. And the response of the armed forces of Russia follows every single time. It will remain this way. Security of Russia will be guaranteed, which was already proved once again on May 28th by the president in order to create a sanitary zone in Ukraine. After the crimes, they're always followed by punishment. Russian courts, using the proof, continue to pass sentences on Ukrainian fighters who continue to commit serious crimes against the civilians. Ukrainian fighters Kolmachevsky, Dobrovolsky, Romashin, and Kulik were sent to life imprisonment. It has been established that due to their orders and actions from 24th of February to 12th of April 2022, in Mariupol, 3 civilians were wounded. One of them was mortally wounded. The court imposed the same sentence in absentia for Ukrainasis Danilov for an order to open fire on the civilians on March 20th, 2022, where 2 civilians were killed. Mr. Sobko was sentenced in absentia to 27 years of imprisonment for attempted murder, as well as attacking of civilian infrastructure in Horlovka. Mr. Domashov, head of the detention center number 23 in Poltava, was sentenced in absentia to 22 years. He was found guilty of mistreatment of prisoners of war. Mr. Shevchuk was sentenced to 24 years in prison for a willful killing of a civilian in Mariupol in March 2022. We repeat once again that we continue to do it and we will continue to do so. All the crimes of the Kiev regime will receive fair assessment and no one will be able to evade the punishment. And as for the astonishing events that are currently taking place at the Ukrainian territory committed by the Kiev regime, we paid attention to the decision of the Kiev court to dismiss what previously was a high-profile case on the dispersal of protesters on the Maidan, which happened from November 30th to the 1st of December, the so-called Berkut case. And the court set the record straight by admitting 9 years later that the Berkut Special Police Forces are acted according to law. They were acquitted on all charges, including their arrested property that was released. And it was on that fateful night that produced the phrase, that coined the phrase, "They are children," as well as heinous lies and the deep fakes of the beatings by the inhuman Berkut officers, which was used as a pretext by the collective Western states to lay the responsibility on Russia for what is taking place in Ukraine. Do you remember how we spoke that they spoke that this was inspired by Russia, together with those made-up crimes of Berkut? And of course, they were trying to prepare the ground to later on bring together the people in Ukraine, to bring them against each other, using this inspired pretext and to turn it into a civil war. The pretext that was used as a trigger to aggressive political campaign against Ukrainian law enforcement agency proved to be fake. Even the corrupt justice system of the so-called main Democrat of Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky, was helpless in the face of truth. It was impossible to hide. There were no documental facts that would testify against the Berkut, and it did not appear in the 9 years. We would like to hope that sooner or later we will find out who was behind the sniper's crime, behind the sniper's case, who gave those orders to shoot in the Kyiv center in those tragic days of February 2014. The sniper shootings in Maidan served as the mechanism or the button that was pressed by the European Union and NATO and the collective West as a whole in order to legitimize the unlawful powers who came to power in Kyiv. And as you know, they reference those shootings by snipers. The Westerners used that when they were speaking about the ex-powers in Ukraine, President Yanukovych, the administration, saying they lost that legitimacy, using the start of shooting as an excuse. And when Russia and many experts, political experts, journalists, and other official figures who dare to ask the question, who was shooting, who gave the order, we received no answers because the Westerners said they have a 100% legitimate information that the shots were fired from the legitimate powers, and this crosses any existing borders. This crosses any lines, which is why they recognize as the legitimate powers those who came to power during Maidan, Yatsenuk and the company. And the Westerners, of course, insisted on an investigation which would reveal the true instigators of those shootings and the snipers who carried out shootings against civilians in Maidan. And how many years have passed since 2014? No one was found. No one was brought to justice. Nothing was established. And I would like to recall that the snipers' actions themselves were used as an excuse by the Westerners in order to legitimize the current people in power. All they were missing was a provocation, and now they got it. At the same time, we understand that the current Kyiv regime, under the fake legitimacy, makes it clear that they will no longer even play democracy. I'm sure that the office of the President of Ukraine will try to eradicate dissent. But we will speak on that and on the Berkut case later on. Now for the important date, June 7th. Marks 230 years since the release of the highest rescript of the Russian Empress Ekaterina II on the building of military harbor and trading pier in the Black Sea Bay on the former site of the Turkish settlement Hagi Bay, which laid the foundation for the future Odessa. And the decree was handed to the Vice Admiral, Mr. Deribas, with the instruction to build the harbor. And today, the Kiev regime is continuing with the line to eradicate the public mind of the population, to eradicate anything Russian or anything that connects Ukraine with Russia. Unfortunately, Odessa is not an exception. It's just another proof of that. And in December 2022, city officials, under the frenzied campaign in order to find the imperial and Soviet legacy, eradicated the monument to the founders of Odessa, Ekaterina II and her companions, who contributed a lot to building of Odessa. And even the Bolsheviks did not dare to do as much, who, having dismantled the monument in 1920, gave most of its elements, including bronze figures of the Empress and her companions, to the Odessa Museum of Original History. But everything got mixed up in those heads that were filled with bloody thoughts.
So the monument was dismantled, and I recall that after this monument was dismantled for the first time in 1920, these elements were preserved by the Bolsheviks, and they were used for the reconstruction of the monument in the early 2000s. By the way, by making a formal application to add the historical center of Odessa to UNESCO list of endangered World Heritage Sites in 2023, Ukraine provided photos of the fenced-off memorials to Catherine the Great and Alexander Suvorov to allegedly protect them from the Russian aggression. But later, these monuments were dismantled by the Kiev regime and not by the Russian aggression, and the international community turned a blind eye to that. Once again, as it was done by UNESCO Secretariat and UNESCO member states. They didn't give a proper response, and we're sure that the day will come when the historical justice would prevail and Odessa will be free and will get rid of everyone who is trying to make the Odessans to forget their glorious past of their favorite city, as well as military feat and hard work. If they want to forget founders of the city, then it seems that the country, its leadership, and its people are suffering from historical amnesia. I would like to also talk about another military aid packages. Zelensky is walking around Europe with an extended hand. On 27th, 28th of May, he visited Madrid, Brussels, and Lisbon, where he signed bilateral security agreements. I recall that similar, and what's important, legally void documents were signed, so to say, with the United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, France, Italy, Denmark, and other countries. One of its main provisions of such so-called documents is that the Western countries reaffirm their commitment to continue to provide the armed forces of Ukraine with military assistance. Spain pledged $1.2 billion in military aid, which will include Patriot anti-ballistic missile systems and Leopard tanks. Only a sixth of these weapons will be provided from the arsenal, and other parts of it will be ordered from the Spanish military industrial complex. Belgium intends to spend in 2024 $1 billion, and it's going to transfer 30 F-16 fighters until 2028. It's quite an important information that is important for countries that are invited to the peace conference in Switzerland. What kind of peace conference we're talking about when NATO countries have long-standing plans to supply its weapons to Ukraine? Portugal cannot boast such scale of spending and hardly scrape together $130 million. Europeans follow the suit of the United States by stimulating at the expense of Ukraine the development of their military industries. However, their combined potential cannot and will not change the situation of the battlefield to Ukraine's benefit. And the Jens Stoltenberg statement on May 27th, which I quote, is 99% of the military support provided to Ukraine is provided by NATO allies, but what we have provided is not enough, is clear confirmation to that. After mobilization law was adopted and after it entered into force, Ukraine is running out of weapons, of money, and now Ukraine is running out of people who are able to fight. Local mass media write about the problem with mobilization and mobilized soldiers themselves. Out of 100% of persons who received conscription notices in Lviv, only 2% of people go to enlistment offices. The same situation is observed in many parts of Ukraine. The same percentage of people mobilized by enlistment officers are eligible for military service. On May 24th, the press service of the General Staff of Ukraine informed that its size will be reduced by 60% and the laid-off soldiers will be sent to the battlefield. At this rate, there will be no one to send NATO weapons. At the same time, in various regions of Ukraine, there are increasing number of cases when residents resist to the forced and violent recruitment actions. Enlistment officers and other manhunters are getting beaten. They are not allowed to enter villages. They are getting people away from the hands of enlistment officers who are paid by NATO countries. There is growing frustration with class inequality and the desire of authorities to enlist the poorest parts of population. It might result into the organization of the new Maidan, and we understand that the new Kiev regime is apparently afraid of new protests and activities and events, and that's why it is sending people to the trenches and to the battlefields. They are sending people to death so that their people wouldn't be able to fight these occupation authorities that is still holding power on the Bankova Street. And that is also one of the reasons why the Ukrainian court acquitted Berkut. Again, it's in line with their mentality. Another area of Western mindset regarding Ukraine. We have received confirmed information from Ukraine that France is planning to deploy its troops in Ukraine. We have provided this information on April 3rd at our briefing. Despite the attempts of France to disguise the participation of its professional soldiers in the conflict, the Kiev regime deliberately promotes it in order to express and to show the wide international support that it enjoys. On May 27th, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Syrskyi, welcomed the initiative of Paris to send instructors to Ukraine in order to train Ukrainian soldiers, and he announced that they signed documents to allow French soldiers to access training centers of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. I think it is time for the French authorities to comment on them and not to hide behind words. Technically, these instructors are necessary to train soldiers how to control and guide Scalp missiles, the so-called long-range autonomous cruise missile system, general purpose. Other types of weapons require the help of Western instructors, and they have been present in Ukraine for a long period of time. The office of the President of Ukraine has realized a long time ago that the Ukrainian warmongers are unable to reverse the situation on the front line on their own. That's why Kyiv is trying to drag NATO countries into direct confrontation with Russia. Apart from France, the ideas on the possible deployment of military contingents were made by Poland and Baltic countries. It shows that their initial plans regarding Ukraine have totally failed, and they are trying to understand how they should develop this campaign. They are afraid to tell the truth to the Ukrainians, that the Ukrainians have become hostages and victims to the reckless scheme of NATO led by the United States. These facts and many others have confirmed that the objectives of the special military operation to denazify and demilitarize of Ukraine and to eliminate threats emanating from its territory hold true, and these objectives will be fulfilled, as I've said many times. And now the human rights situation in Ukraine. It sounds contradictory, but we have to use this phrase to gather facts and to analyze them, to provide legal assessment in the future, because international legal assessment can be given today in the political dimension, but in terms of legal dimension and in terms of the punishment of crimes, this information is being collected for the future prosecution process. Yesterday, we have published another report on our website on the human rights situation in Ukraine. It was prepared by our ministry. We know that over the past years, the human rights situation in Ukraine has relentlessly degraded, and the current situation in this area is so critical that it will become clear to any independently thinking person that Kyiv authorities that are outright Nazis, they commit countless numbers of gross violations and systematic violations of human rights in all areas of public life. At the same time, there is an apparent and complete failure of the authorities to create the appearance of the efforts to address the backlog of serious issues and to bring to justice all those responsible for committing so many crimes, including one of the atrocious ones when people were burnt alive in the house of trade unions in Odessa in 2014. We see that the civil society, including children, are violently killed, how the civilian infrastructure is being destroyed, how acts of terrorism are carried out against civilians. We have repeatedly noted that neo-Nazism in Ukraine, including aggressive propaganda of this ideology, falsification of history of the Great Patriotic War and the Second World War, in order to glorify Nazis and their accomplices and to implant nationalist attitudes in the Ukrainian society, have been practiced for a long period of time. The report provides a lot of evidence of neo-Nazism in this country, starting from torchlit marchers when we were ringing the alarm, and we did our best so that the world and the Western countries in particular would see what's going on in Ukraine. And we understand that we did a right job. And we were absolutely right. How we can change the history if the collective West hadn't sponsored these ideologies and would correct the Kyiv regime, because such torchlit marches are honoring the Nazi criminal Stepan Bandera. Kyiv is glorifying SS Galician division, and they are glorifying and commemorating the few still living former members of these criminal organizations. They are publishing books about Nazis, and there are even memoirs of noted Nazis who were on the side of Hitler. For example, the recent publication is the memoir of the head of the puppet government of Croatia, the ally of the Nazi Germany in 1941 and 1945, Ante Pavelic. The Nazi approaches of Kiev are realized to the full extent with regard to the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine. In this country, everything Russian is prohibited, like language, culture, education, press, and mass media. The Russification process has reached its climax in education. It is prohibited to use Russian as a language of instruction and to learn it at school. Back then, many years ago, they were saying to us that we are making it up, that the Russian language is not prohibited, that they like the Russian language. But actually, they have been adopting laws, instructions, they have been approving conceptual documents, how to minimize the use of the Russian language in Ukraine, how to make people stop speaking this language, how to create the appearance that the Russian language is not one of the essential ones on the territory of Ukraine. Well, who wants to see the situation will see that, but many prefer again to turn the blind eye to the situation. But we see again that we were right in our assessments. All the literature works of Russian and Soviet, apart from Ukrainian authors, are taken away from the school literature programs. Books in Russian language are taken off the shelves in libraries, and they are thrown away as garbage. School students and teachers are prohibited to even speak Russian, not only during lessons, but in their private conversations during recess. Moreover, the Kiev authorities, supporting the harassment campaign of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, they made attacks on its churches legal, and the clergy of this church is denigrated in every way. So we see that in its complacent readiness to the detriment of the interests of its people, and by moving the country towards self-destruction, by turning Ukraine into anti-Russia, is the reason why overseas mentors are turning the blind eye to the neo-Nazi essence of the Kiev regime. There is an obvious parallel with how the Western countries treated the Hitlerite regime in the lead-up to the Second World War. You remember the so-called appeasement policy that resulted in the bloodiest war in the humankind's history. Luckily for the present generation, this war has ended with the victory of the anti-Hitler coalition, and the fact that such disasters shouldn't reoccur in the future has become a fundamental principle of the UN Charter. Another country where Western countries are carrying out their awful experiments, Moldova. On May 23rd, the foreign minister of Moldova, Mikhail Popshoy, accused our country of the attempts to undermine the economy of Moldova and to bring to power criminal groups. By using this term, Moldovan authorities refer to their political opponents. The hidden motive of such baseless accusations is clear. They are trying to make Russia responsible for their failed economic policy, to justify rampant corruption and lawlessness practiced by the Moldovan authorities. That's actually what they have been doing. They have been promoting Western values, but these Western values have been distorted by Maria Sandu regime. So here are some recent examples of the so-called achievements of the Maia Sandu team. We see that the foreign trade performance of Moldova continues to fall. Is it Russia's fault that invested in Moldova and helped this country for so many years, and the Maia Sandu administration refused such options? In January and March, on year-on-year basis, the Moldovan export dropped by 14%, and the re-export of foreign goods has decreased by 38.6%, and the export of goods to the EU countries has reduced by 9.3%, and to the CIS countries it has dropped by 28.7%. The same situation is with the Moldovan imports, which has reduced overall by 6.6%, and from the EU country by 8.7%, and from the CIS countries by 61.9%. Independent observers are ringing the alarm about the consistent dismantlement of the education system under the pretext of the so-called optimization, which results into the closure of schools. The system of rural schools is on the verge of collapse, and as of 2023, per 10,000 Moldovans, there were 226 university students and 57 students of vocational schools, which is far less than in any country of the CIS and the EU. I have a question for Maria Sandu, who likes to criticize the Soviet Union, who says every time that at the Soviet era, Moldova was in a devastated situation. Maybe she should provide statistics how Moldova lived during the Soviet period. And maybe after that, Maria Sandu should demonstrate her own achievements that she reached thanks to the Western values. The birth rate in Moldova is declining. In 2023, there were 24,000 new babies, which is 11% less than in 2022. It's not caused by conflicts or war. It is caused by Maria Sandu policy. Militarization is gaining ground, and Moldova is getting closer to NATO in 2024. 17 military exercises and maneuvers were organized in this country, including with the participation of American and Romanian troops. I understand why the birth rate is declining, since they're organizing so many exercises with the participation of American and Romanian troops. Moldovan man has no time to make babies because they are participating in exercises.
On 24th of May, the Minister of Defense signed a protocol in order to introduce the stopping of the cooperation in 2012. And what do the Moldovan experts say about it? They review this document as a step to try to control the armed forces, as a strike, as a blow to the Moldovan sovereignty and the neutral status. We've drawn attention numerous times to the shameful practices of hours-long searches in the Chisinau airport. And on May 28th, this happened toward the leader of the opposing party, Chance, Alexei Lungu, who returned from Moscow after participating in the International Forum BRICS 2024. And the search procedure is applied even to those who wish to fly from Chisinau to Russia. And on May 23rd, youth activists from Moldova were supposed to leave for Moscow in order to participate in cultural humanitarian program, Get to Know Russia. And they were exposed to a security check, and they missed their flight. Such politics causes annoyance among the population, and Moldovans understand that the main reason for serious issues in the country is the incompetence of authorities who don't believe in their country, or trying to harm the country, and the so-called harmful actions of Russia have nothing to do with it. When the authorities deny the population their rights to the language, to their history, trying to impose whatever they want, trying to eradicate anything that was established with the generation, this is the true reason for the suffering. According to the latest opinion polls, 56% of respondents are convinced that Sandu either had little to do with the internal affairs of the country or doesn't care for them. And the main part is if Sandu openly stated that she is the Romanian citizen and she's the handler, and the government is built of the same people. There's no Moldovan language. There's only place for Romanian language. And as we found out from the statements of the Sandu regime representatives, they even questioned the nationality of Moldovans, and they prefer the Romanians. Almost 50% of respondents believe that under the rule of the Party of Action and Solidarity, or from 2021 to 2024, the economic situation in the country has worsened and the poverty is rising, as the Moldovan politologists point out, the Sandu team, even with the help of political engineers, didn't perfect the art of throwing in random facts, and she's just a failed student. As for the Western, on the May 27th, the European Union used a new sanction regime against Russia by using the human rights violations, repressions of civil society, and democratic opposition. And the new sanction regime can be referred to as new only in quotation marks. We've lost count to the illegitimate steps of Brussels. They are clear evidence of the destructive policy of the European Union and the human rights structure that they only claim to pay so much attention to. And if we put aside their empty words, they're trying to build an openly discriminatory mechanism in order to punish citizens of Russia for the sheer striving to live in a country free from foreign influence, uphold their national interests, speak Russian, and be the citizens who love their country. We view these sanctions as a flagrant violation of the international law, including the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states. This is an apparent manifestation of neo-colonial approaches, using the human rights institution in order to solve their narrow, selfish tasks leads to nothing but to the instrumentalization of the fight of those countries who don't serve their interests. It turns international relations into a dictate of right democracies, and Russia is consequently fighting the efforts to manipulate the human rights theme to serve political interests, which is why it is regularly subjected to the punishing mayors of the collective Brussels. It has nothing to do with a concern for human rights or the real situation in human rights. Whether it be our country or anywhere else, the sanction politics of the EU has nothing to do with that. We would like to draw your attention that the new sanctions are undertaken ahead of the upcoming elections to the European Parliament planned for June 6th to 9th, since it is predicted that the positions will be strengthened of the nationally oriented political powers. Euro bureaucrats had nothing better in mind than to shift the focus from real social economical problems in the EU countries to the Russian subject. They already conducted search in order to detect so-called Russian influence in the European Union countries. We reject the efforts of the EU leadership to use the Russian theme as a dirty means in their election campaigns in order to denigrate and get rid of political opponents and repressions towards the alternating mass media opinions. It is astonishing that in the flourishing EU garden, as Borrell claimed, they don't notice the most obvious facts, the self-revealing Russophobia and the consolidation of our society who understands the real goals of European Union and the West as a whole, and none of these escapades could waver our resolve to act based on national interests, ensuring the security and real protection of the rights of our citizens. And among these things, who bring nothing new, but who introduce real measures and who hit the European Union countries. Recently, in Poland, they announced their decision to restrict Russian diplomats' free movement in the country. Russian diplomats in Poland suffer so much pressure and dehumanization. I can't even name them all. Just remember what they did to our ambassador, Mr. Andreev, who tried to lay flowers to the monument of the Second World War, or our Great Patriotic War. You remember what this overseen by the NATO powers group of people did to him. If someone thinks that this is not enough, no. Once again, the elections to the European Parliament are coming. And then a lot is at stake. Interests of the collective Brussels, which is why they need to activate the Russophobic theme with search warrants, with anti-Russian human rights sanction regimes, and of course lay all the responsibility on Russian diplomats. On May 28th, Russian embassy in Warsaw received a note from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Poland, which introduces the restrictions on the diplomats' free movement in the country. Starting from June 1st, they advised that we give advance notice to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Poland of intention of the employees of the Embassy of Russia in Warsaw, as well as the Gdansk and Krakow and Poznan, to leave the Polish provinces where the Russian foreign missions are in power, stating last names, dates, purpose of the travel, the means of transport, and their route of travel. And of course, there is an exception to the ambassador of Russia in Poland, general councils, and the head of the council. There are no explanations for the measures, but they connect this to the so-called hybrid war. Why is it so-called hybrid war? Because apparently Russia is conducting this hybrid war against Poland, which is ridiculous. Because Poland is supplying Kiev regime with military equipment, is taking charge of anything that is Zelensky conducting against Russia, but apparently Russia is the one conducting hybrid war against Poland. These absurd accusations are of no surprise to us anymore. They only make us laugh, and of course they stimulate us to come up with response measures. This is not the first step of the Polish authorities aimed at making the work of Russian diplomats as difficult as possible. Polish side over the last years is trying to come up with issues for our embassy, including freezing of assets, withdrawing the means, and mass sending back of our employees. And they're creating obstacles in solving a number of issues. As you know, Russia will take responsive measures against the Polish embassy in Moscow, the General Consulate in Irkutsk, Kaliningrad, and St. Petersburg. So what did Warsaw do with their actions? The only thing they did, they will only create new obstacles for their colleagues or the Polish diplomats who are working in Russia. Once again, I guess they just needed it for the main anti-Russian backdrop ahead of the elections. On the 22nd of May, the Council of Ministers of the Republic of Belarus adopted a decree to deliver humanitarian aid in order to help the flood-affected regions of Russia, and we thank our Belarusian friends for their help, for the attention that was paid to our citizens who found themselves in a very difficult situation. And we see that as a sign of fraternal relations and of the unity of our people. We cherish our allied relations, and we're convinced that the Belarusian aid will reach anyone in need, and that it will be felt, and it will help us to restore any regions that were affected. On May 24th, Mali hosted foundation stone laying ceremony of 200 megawatt solar power plant that is conducted by the Russian company Nova Wind, which belongs to the state corporation structure Rosatom. Of course, the event was attended by the head of state, the interim president of Mali. This event marks the beginning of realization in Mali, together with Russia, large projects in energy sphere. With Russian assistance, then they plan a construction of the solar power plant worth 200 megawatt, as well as the wind park of 100 megawatts. These projects should help handle the acute deficit of electric energy. And as you understand, of course, the population is the one suffering from that. The first infrastructure objects will be built by Nova Wind based on the public-private partnership. Russia is committed to provide further assistance to a friendly Mali people in the upcoming difficult period, help with solving problems, to ensure true sovereignty and independence of the Republic. Yesterday, on May 29th, the celebrated the International Day of the United Nations Peacekeepers. This day was established in 2002 by the UN General Assembly Resolution 57/129. For over 20 years, we pay tribute to all the military and police officials, civilian specialists who continue to serve among the peacekeeping forces, showing high professionalism and bravery. As for our country, Russia is contributing significantly to the UN peacekeeping, and the efforts of our blue helmets deserve high praise. They contribute to settling armed conflicts all over the world, from Western Sahara and South Sudan to the Middle East and Cyprus. Russia is among the 10 main contributors to the budget of UN operations in order to preserve peace. Based on our training centers, there is an effective preparation of both Russian and foreign peacekeepers based on the UN Secretariat certified programs. Unfortunately, right now the UN peacekeeping is going through a rough patch. And more often than not, they ignore the needs and concerns of the host states. Their focus of action is shifted to secondary issues unrelated to conflict resolution. Fight against the spread of misinformation is often used as a pretext for censorship of fair criticism toward blue helmets, which leads to frustration among states who receive peacekeeping forces in their territory and damages the authority of the United Nations itself. The MINUSMA drawdown and the MINUSCA withdrawal underway are anything but coincidental. The Russian side consistently proceeds from the fact that the mandates of peacekeeping operations should be clear, calibrated, and realistic. They should match the resources at our disposal and respond to the imminent task, reconciliation of the parties in conflict. Their exaggeration by using the secondary issues in the Western agenda is highly counterproductive, which we perfectly understand and repeat again and again. It's equally important to assure the strict adherence to basic principle of peacekeeping, consent of the parties, impartiality, and non-use of force except in self-defense and defense of mandate. Otherwise, it increases the risk of undermining the neutral status of blue helmets, their shift into becoming a party to the conflict, as well as multiplying threats to the lives of peacekeepers. Overall, we're convinced that only a well-balanced, non-politicized, and priorities-based approach will help weather the peacekeeping crisis and help restore its credibility and efficiency. Another important date, yesterday on May 29th, marked 10 years since the signature of the Treaty of the Eurasian Economic Union. EU Treaty is a core document which laid the foundation to the Eurasian economic integration. Due to consistent joint efforts in certain areas, its member states, Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Kyrgyzstan, managed to transform it into an important pole of international economic relations. This is evidenced by the EU network of economic relations, which includes free trade agreements with Vietnam, Serbia, and Iran, as well as non-preferential agreement with China, over 80 memorandums of cooperation through the Union's supranational body, the Eurasian Economic Commission. Currently, the work began to negotiate trade agreements with Egypt, Indonesia, UAE, and Mongolia. A rather important role falls on active cooperation with observer states, Uzbekistan and Cuba. Such positive international results stem from the EU being a reliable partner, acting based on the principles of trust, respect, and conservation of interests of all parties involved. This, in turn, generates a growing interest in cooperation from other countries and integration associations. We would like to congratulate all our colleagues and state members in Eurasian Economic Commission on this important date, and without their efforts, these results would never be important. And there was a statement of Mr. Pankin, which was already published on our website and in social media, in official MFA accounts. And very important announcement. This was asked by the journalists. The public spoke up with proposals. We've worked it out. On May 21st, the Department of State Protocol, together with the Russian Defense Ministry, will organize for the diplomatic corps a visit to captured Western weapons and equipment exhibited at Poklonная Gora, which I would like to recall over the period of its work, over 890,000 people visited it, almost a million. Diplomats can see firsthand much vaunted NATO equipment, including the German tank Leopard 2 and American Abrams, that were struck by the military personnel of Russian armed forces. The exhibits evidently debunk the myth of the superiority and high combat power of Western models of weapons, dozens of which are destroyed during the special military operation. The visit of representatives of the diplomatic corps is of the highest significance ahead of the celebration of the 80 years of the victory in the Great Patriotic War, which exposes the cynicism of our ex-allies on the Normandy landings in 1944 and other leaders of unfriendly states who currently speak of using the arms supplied by them in Ukraine in order to strike deep inside Russia. But as for the exhibit in Normandy, we will speak on that later on. On June 1st, the International Day for Protection of Children, the 28th International Charity Golf Tournament, will be held in the branch of Russia's MFA Glove UPTK Moscow Country Club. As per tradition, Russia's oldest charity golf tournament will bring together foreign diplomats, Russian politicians and businessmen, sportsmen, performers, and public figures. All raised funds will be used to provide targeted assistance to critically ill children and transferred to the envoys of the charity foundations, Vera Important People Lighthouse, as well as the Kabensky Foundation and the MFA boarding school. The festival program includes exercise warm-up routine from Svetlana Kolesnichenko, three-time Olympic champion in synchronized swimming, arts, sports, and entertainment workshops, movie screenings, a concert with famous pop singers, as well as a chance to meet Alexander Tsipkin, Russian author and screenwriter, creator of the literary theatrical project Unprincipled Readings. And we invite representatives of mass media to take part in covering these events. And another event that we'd like to invite you to, on June 2nd, Moscow will host the final of the national competition Dream Team. The event will be organized in order to identify and encourage the best young sinologists. The organizer is the Association of the Advancement of Sinology in Russia. Since 2018, the association has been organizing specialized international conferences, professional contests, as well as creating curated informational resources in the fields of science and business. The competition Dream Team has been held since 2023. The first finalists have already completed internships in famous companies, found jobs in the sphere of Russian-Chinese practical cooperation. This year, after the qualifying round, 36 people from 16 universities of Russia have reached the finals, including from Kalmykia, Murtia, St. Petersburg, Belgorod, Moscow, and Moscow region. These contest provides a unique opportunity for them to showcase their knowledge and skills, receive highly important advice from leading experts, and establish professional connections. The judges board comprises of prominent figures in Chinese studies as well as representatives of business and media circles. We consider these events important in order to prepare qualified personnel who are in high demand for the development of multifaceted set of comprehensive Russian-Chinese partnership and strategic cooperation. The cooperation of our countries is actively developing in any area, which is why there is a high demand for professional specialists who would be able to both ensure bilateral contacts and generate new ideas and projects. This demand is very high and it will keep up. And we wish the participants every success, a fair fight, most brilliant victories to come, and the most interesting stories for the mass media, of course. June 6th.
This year, this day will mark the 80 years since the Allied coalition landed on the French coast in Normandy. At that time, it marked the opening of the Second Front in Europe. Today, in the Western countries, D-Day is presented as the key event that predetermined the outcome of the Second World War. We have heard that in the statements of the Western leaders. It's just enough to mention the megalomaniac statements of the U.S. leadership and their closest allies that could claim that they have saved Europe and the world from fascism. Such position is held by a strong part of the politically engaged Western historical community, and we see that at the instigation of Western authorities, such approaches are reflected in school textbooks, and the West doesn't say any word about the fact that this landing in Normandy will be impossible without the success of the Red Army. I'm talking about methodological blasphemous attempts to implant in the mindset of the post-war generations in the West, whose populations have been brainwashed for years, but in the Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet republics, the ideas that highlight the decisive contribution of the Allies in the defeat of the Third Reich and ignore the genuine liberating role of the Red Army. They cynically silence the fact that the Great Britain and the United States of America have been postponing under various pretexts the opening of the second front line. They were waiting for the outcome of the deadly battle between the Red Army and Wehrmacht for 3 years. One-on-one, the Soviet Union called on allies to start fighting on the European continent. With the heavy conditions of the first month of the Great Patriotic War, the issue of opening the second front was extremely important for Moscow, and the Soviet leadership for the first time used this phrase on September 3rd, 1941, in its letter to Winston Churchill by calling it to open the second front on the Balkans or in France. However, under various mischievous pretexts, Britain and then the United States postponed the landing of their forces, and they have taken the wait-and-see approach. The Red Army has stopped on its own the advancement of the German troops near Moscow in autumn 1941 and in 1942 when the Battle of Stalingrad erupted, and in summer 1943 when the Battle of Kursk has been determining the outcome of the entire war. As a result, in June 1944, with the start of active military operations of the heroic Red Army on the European territory, the outcome of the war had already been predetermined. The Soviet leadership, however, commended the landing of the Allied forces in Normandy in June 1944. The Red Army, by carrying out its Allied duty, from its part deployed a major offensive along the entire Eastern Front. During the Bagration operation, the enemy was thrown back to the west by 550 and 600 kilometers, and the Wehrmacht lost 916,000 people in 1944. Thanks to the effective actions, the Soviet command has entirely crushed the army group center of the Wehrmacht, and the most favorable conditions were created for the Allied forces to move towards the western theater of operation. The Red Army soldiers have sustained a lot of losses when they liberated European countries. For example, in Czechoslovakia, the defense of Nazis was so strong that so many people were killed. 3 million of Red Army soldiers were wounded or went missing. In 1944 and 1945, the Red Army has completely or partially liberated territories of 10 European countries. We wouldn't mind if the countries of Central or Eastern Europe were liberated by the Western countries. That would save lives of our soldiers who died in 1944 and 1945. We're talking about millions of deaths of the Red Army soldiers. They would be alive and they would come back to their families. But they died outside the Soviet Union by liberating Europe from Nazism. They were waiting for the help of their allies. That's why London and Washington should have opened the second front much earlier, and they should have been ready for the millions of losses from their side. As we commemorate the 80th anniversary of the Normandy landings, we bow our heads to pay respect to those fallen in the battles with the Hitlerites. But we won't allow to belittle, to downplay, or to bury into oblivion the act of heroism of our ancestors and those who firmly press their case for the genuine liberation of Western European countries from the totalitarian dictatorship, unlike their brothers in Central and Eastern Europe, where the Nazi occupation was replaced by the Soviet one. We would like to recall about the scale of assistance that was provided by the Soviet Union while it was facing devastation and difficult post-war situation. We regularly provide information about that and statistical data. In its memoirs, the Marshal of Victory, Georgy Zhukov, paid homage to the dedication of the Allied forces, but he didn't exaggerate the significance of the Second Front. He noted that the help of the Allies helped to the Red Army and to the military industry, but it shouldn't be assigned a greater role than it was in reality. I will go back to the events that will be organized at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum by our ministry on June 7th in the morning. We're going to organize an offline briefing, and we will provide an opportunity for journalists to take part online in this briefing. It has become a tradition to meet with the accredited media representatives. On this occasion, we kindly ask you to ask your questions that you are interested in receiving questions. You can find all the information on the website of the Russian Foreign Ministry. Right after that, the Russian Foreign Ministry will organize a session, International and National Experience of Regulating the AI Sphere, Best Practices. We plan to explore risks and opportunities in the use of AI technologies in all spheres of life, as well as their misuse by some states. Experts, political and public figures will discuss what regulation of the AI is necessary today at the international and national levels, and what new formats of interaction are necessary to deal with the technological monopoly of the West. This is just an announcement for you, because we're going to discuss different topics. So we kindly ask you and invite you to take part in them. On June 8th, the magazine International Life is going to organize a panel discussion, Polycentricity as the Norm of a Future World Free of Colonies and Hegemons. Executive and legislative authorities, scientists, and experts will discuss prospects for the formation of a new architecture of international relations, the role of our country in building a more just multiple world order, strategy of countering modern neo-colonial practices and manifestations on the part of the collective West. So again, we invite all of you to attend these events, and we will organize a live broadcast of these discussions in our social media accounts, and we will wait for you in St. Petersburg and see you there. And for those who are unable to visit St. Petersburg, you can have a look at the live broadcast, and I'm giving the floor to Международная жизнь. It's time for question and answers. Good afternoon. I would like to know your comment with regard to the results of the trilateral summit Japan, Korea, China that took place in Seoul on May 27th. It's not the first summit, but the ninth one that is organized in the trilateral format, although there was 5 years. It was suspended for 5 years. We're talking about the dialogue of 3 countries, but I would like to highlight our principled position that it concerns sovereign states, and it is up to them how to develop their relations, in what format they should have meetings. And we support the development of their practical cooperations in the spirit of good neighborliness that would contribute to security, stability, and prosperity of the northeastern Asia. We welcome such intentions. At the same time, we view the attempts of some overseas allies of the United States to politicize this process and to add extra regional issues to the trilateral agenda, including situation in Ukraine, as incompatible with the goals of such format. In the Chinese language, there is quite an interesting phrase, 笑里藏刀, which can be translated as a hide a dagger behind a smile. I think it's quite suitable to the actions of Japan and the Republic of Korea that are taking part in the narrow selective military and diplomatic clubs in the Asia-Pacific region curated by Washington. These clubs have anti-Chinese and anti-Russian bias. The actions of such associations undermine the ASEAN-centric security architecture in the region and provoke an escalation of tensions in the northeastern Asia, as well as in the South China Sea and around Taiwan. So our common approaches with our Chinese friends on these matters are reflected in the joint statement that was signed by the Russian and Chinese leaders following the summit in Beijing on May 16th. Thank you. And I have another question, if I may. Since you touched on this topic, I'm talking about the hypothetical deployment of NATO troops to Ukraine. Foreign Minister of Poland, Radoslaw Sikorski, in his interview to Gazeta Wyborcza, assumed that Poland might deploy troops to Ukraine, and he said that we shouldn't rule out any opportunity. I've touched on that already, about some statements that there are discussions to allow Ukraine to strike deep inside our country. Some countries say that they authorize Kiev to do so. Other countries say that they need to reflect on that. Other countries say that they do not allow it for the time being, but it's not true. They are encouraging these attacks inside the Russian territory. So what am I talking about? Who is providing the pilot assignments and pilot details? Zelensky? Someone else? Where do they receive information from the satellites, geolocations, reconnaissance information? All of that is provided by the Western countries because they're using space reconnaissance technologies. I've been talking about it for so many times. I don't remember that Ukraine was a space power that is sending rockets to space. No, it is all provided by the Western countries. Without providing such data, it is impossible to fight in today's realities, in today's context. So the Western countries are doing everything. They have destroyed Ukraine, deprived it of freedom and independence. They brought political leaders to power with the passports of Western countries, how they were setting Ukrainians against one another. Then they set Ukraine against Russia. For all these years, not for 2, not for 3, but for 10 years, they have been present in Ukraine in the form of instructors and security officers. They were present in the region, in the how they were training people on the Maidan, how they trained people in Poland, in Germany, and they continue to do so by supplying weapons, by sending instructors, by sending technologies to Ukraine, by providing Ukraine with intelligence data, and by coordinating military actions of Ukraine. This game of approve, disapprove, actually, it is cunning. That's what the Russian leadership has been talking about for years. It's a hybrid warfare that is being waged by the collective West, led by the United States and the Anglo-Saxon, that is waged against our country through Ukraine. And as for the statement that you mentioned, Sikorski's statement, it was made in his interview to Gazeta Wyborcza. He didn't rule out the deployment of Polish troops to Ukraine. Later, press secretary of the Polish Foreign Ministry, Paweł Wronski, informed that Poland today is not deploying troops to Ukraine, but it shouldn't be ruled out in the future because it is yet unknown how the situation might evolve in the future. Political circles sleep and see when and dream about the fact when they will be approved to do what they have been dreaming about for so many years. In particular, they want to invade a part of Ukraine. At many levels and many platforms, the Polish leadership chants as a mantra the need to inflict a strategic defeat in our country, and Poland is one of the main sponsors of the Ukrainian regime. And if earlier Warsaw believed that Ukraine could obtain victory on its own, but now their forecasts changed. They have just looked out of the window and saw the real situation, and they're considering different options, including the deployment of a Polish military contingent. It is not stated officially, but Polish soldiers and instructors have been sent to Ukraine for so many years. As Azov battalion was training in the Baltic countries and in Poland. There are a lot of Polish mercenaries, including professional soldiers, that are fighting on the side of the armed forces of Ukraine. In the current international situation, Warsaw sees and doesn't conceal it a historical chance to inflict a strategic defeat on our country. But behind closed doors, they express their desire to get even with Moscow for the geopolitical confrontation that they lost in the past, and they want to strengthen their positions in Ukraine. And also, they're interested in the western parts of Ukraine. They want to restore Ukraine. They have expressed their interests, but we know that today's political establishment of Poland helped to restore other countries, other states in different parts of the world. We are aware of their experience. It's the Soviet Union who helped to restore Poland, but I have no recollection whom Poland helped to restore their statehood. So when they are saying that they're interested in restoring the statehood of Ukraine, they're interested in deploying a military contingent in the western part of Ukraine, and it might be like that forever and protracted for a long time.
Is Ria Novosti with us? Yes, good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. We have two questions today. Recently, a French edition media part stated that France is training the military personnel of Ukrainian armed forces who pursue the radical opinions. How can you comment? Why do you provide quotes from French editions? Well, we've already spoken about it before. This edition is quite infamous. It focuses on different investigations, but I'd like to point out that materials about the neo-Nazist ideology of the military of the 3rd Storm Brigade of Ukrainian Armed Forces, who are training in the Lac Routine training camp in the New Aquitania. But these materials have been circulating in other mass media because these are the proven facts of the Azov legacy representatives, but of the Hitler greetings or any fascist symbols. And French military and the French army cannot be unaware of this. We presented images, we spread the materials among the international organizations. Our Minister Lavrov, presented giant piles of documents during the negotiations with the representatives of the West. So it's surprising that the Western journalists are surprised by it. Of course, it's better late than never, but perhaps it should be done more rigorously. Over the years, we've spoken about it at length. We have been exposing the truth. We've used our bare hands to provide these materials, but there's another side of the issue. the neo-Nazis' nature reflects not only in the symbols or the greetings or the tattoos. This has been established long before, just as the marches. But they also proclaim their heroes, their teachers, collaborationists, and first of all, it reflects in their desire to eradicate any kind of foreign thinking, even based on the ethnic and confessional thinking, the Russian language that the Kiev regime is trying to fight so hard, and the entire society of so-called experts, political experts, who were supposed to provide the base for the local authorities to pessimicize the Russian language and to legitimize the discrimination of the Russian language. This attitude to Russians and inhumane attitude to the role of peoples who live in Ukraine. They see them as a threat to the country. They're trying to shift the history to eradicate monuments, trying to shift the heroism towards new anti-heroes, so on and so forth. And of course, it can be seen in mass year-long physical repercussions. Even the Orthodox Church is being persecuted, and there's a punishing war in Donbass. They're murdering civilians, they're torturing military hostages, and they're targeting the civilian infrastructure in Russian towns and villages. And the same acts of the Nazis in the first 30 years of the 20th century, all this is reincarnating in the Kiev regime nowadays. We can only wish to the journalists of the French newspapers to have more confidence, to open new doors in their investigations and to keep going with it. We would like to believe that it's possible, but we're trying to have a realistic approach that it will continue to stay this way, that perhaps someone will try to search these same editions, perhaps to have a strong talk. And Paris perfectly understands who supports, who supplies, and trains the Kiev regime. But we also see that one of the mottos of the West is any means is as good as necessary against Russia. And the terrorists of the Kiev regime care nothing but inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia. And in 1938, the so-called West Democrats tried to collude with Munich and with German Nazis, trying to send them against our countries. And it was not a peaceful protest against the Nazis and against the Hitler, but they were trying to send it against the Soviet Union, and right now they're using Ukro-Nazis, once again trying to inflict a strategic defeat on us that Napoleon dreamed about, then Hitler and now the collective West as a whole dreams about it, but they will not succeed. 80 years ago, we liberated ourselves from the Nazism and liberated Europe from it. And we continue to decisively stand against this hateful ideology in any forms, any methods, and we can identify these Nazism immediately and we fight it strongly. It's part of our national policy. This is part of our national interests as a state, as a country, as a people, and as a civilization. Which is why right now, perhaps it's already over, but even in your agency there was a conference, a round table dedicated to the subject of denazification of Ukraine. and we would be very glad to hear about the results, and perhaps we will be able to use them later on in our action. You've mentioned you have another question for us? Yes. This is for the statement of the Prime Minister of Romania, Mr. Ciolacu, who stated that in Moldova and in Ukraine, the quote, they've managed to eradicate the Soviet concept, the Moldovan language. How could you comment on that? Don't you think this is exactly the personification of Nazism? People of an ethnic group, of a national group, they're trying to influence them and they're trying to punish them for being part of another group. This is the definition of Nazism. These are the elements of genocide, of trying to eradicate people. We've already commented on the efforts of trying to eradicate the self-proclamation of the Moldovan people. We don't even speak on the form because it's impossible to hear of such things in the 21st century, that someone who speaks Moldovan language, who has books, textbooks, documents, and the basic laws are in Moldovan language, who speak of the self-proclamation rights, and suddenly these people are being told that they either need to learn another language or they should have a Romanian-like name. It's absolutely unacceptable, and it should be unacceptable even as an idea, and we see that in practice already. But as for the substance, it has nothing to do with historical truth. Moldovan language is mentioned in the works of historians of the 17th and 18th centuries: Grigore Reki, Miron Costin, Dmitry Cantemir. Can you imagine their surprise if they saw the statement of the Romanian Prime Minister that their Moldovan language is nothing but a Soviet concept? How many years has their work lasted? Over 300 years before the Soviet times. They lived and wrote in that language, and right now they're being labeled as those who acted before the socialist concepts. Let's give a word to the population of Moldova. According to the public poll, 72% of Moldovans consider themselves citizens of a republic, and only 11% consider themselves Romanian. Around 50% claim that they speak Moldovan language, that the heads of Moldova and Romania believe doesn't even exist. This is the artificial Romanization that can only be compared to different efforts of people to rewrite history by trying to force the change in a cultural code that was practiced by Nazis as well. And we see that what is currently taking place, on the one hand, is absolutely inhumane, and in turn it's having the opposite effect. And what Bucharest and Chisinau wanted is backfiring at them. It only consolidates the Moldovan society. They're ready to fight for their right for their statehood, their language and culture. And you know, I have a lot of friends in Moldova, a lot of Moldovan friends. I talk with them frequently, and they say the following: we're peaceful. We want to live in kindness and peaceful coexistence and good neighborhoodness. That perhaps this shakedown that has been instigated by Sandu was done for the sole purpose of understanding what kind of plans towards these friendly people the collective West was harboring. So if they have these terrible steps, so they're basically conducting an experiment on Moldovans. Perhaps without these plans, Moldovans would never believe them. 5-6 years ago, they would consider it a conspiracy theory, but right now, unfortunately, they're witnessing firsthand these surrealist postmodern, and they're living through this practice, not just an idea. Is Russia today with us? Yes, good afternoon, dear colleagues and Madam Zakharova. Igor Breskunov, RT. Of course, I recognize you. I would like to thank you for such a substantive presentation. You've already mentioned Sweden and the recent statements from there as for the possible attacks against the Russian territory. How could you comment the situation with the denial of the press service of the Armed Forces of Sweden of the words of the head, Mikael Buden, on the presence of the military threat to Gotland from Russia? You know, when you see it in the news feed, my first reaction was, oh my god, is that the sequel to Harry Potter? Because it seems unreal. It's as if they're speaking about fairy tale characters. They're horrifying news. And then, as I've paid closer attention, no, there is such a person, Mikael Buden, who believed that Gotland is facing a threat, and of course it has to come from Russia. As they try to prepare a fact check, and apparently there is a sequel to that fairy tale. Because the press service, his own press service of the Armed Forces of Sweden, who provided a fact check and denied the words of their own chief, who proved not only his own words to be false, but even the NATO statements. Because the NATO General Secretary and the Admiral Mr. Bauer repeatedly spoke of the lack of the threat of Russian attack against the NATO countries. So perhaps something ricocheted against his head and he got some kind of idea. We can only analyze his words and statements. They're trying to build a mythology, to build new concepts on how to demonize Russia for different reasons. Sometimes they need to adopt a military budget. Sometimes without holding referendum, they need to introduce a country and accept it as a NATO member, the country that used to believe it was neutral. And a lot of people in Sweden still wish to keep that neutral status. Or perhaps it is dictated by the electoral cycles in Brussels. There are polished statements towards Russian diplomats, search warrants, search operations in different countries that also have their claws deep in the European Parliament. And of course, it all falls in the same category. Perhaps he tried a little too hard somewhere, or perhaps there was the reaction from the Swedish population, or perhaps these are the ideas that the NATO chiefs need at the moment. This isn't the first time, and we've heard such statements from the Northern Europe more than once, and then they were proven to be false. Because such statements demands facts, demands evidence that proves that it's true. So of course, as there were no such facts, they're later proven to be false. And this is the same kind of idea that submarines or air gallons were coming to surface, and we've seen different things. And apparently these are just shards of boats that had sunk long before local fishermen, or some kind of metal waste in the waters. So there's a lot of noise, just a short statement denying those words. So this is nothing but an information campaign that is the collective West tries to use ahead of the European Parliament elections. And everything points towards that. If that's all, is the Chinese Media Corporation with us? Yes, good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. We have two questions. The press answer published a report on the human rights violation in the United States of America. First is the pretext, violations of civil rights, fight of racism, growing social injustices, violations of child and women rights, rights of migrants, the humanitarian crisis, and the American hegemony. How do you assess this report? What do you think of the adherence or the non-adherence to the human rights in the US? I try not to think about the adherence to the human rights in the United States of America because these are destructive thoughts if you think about what is going on there. But of course, during our work, we have to talk about it. As for the Beijing's efforts, then Moscow welcomes these efforts. As for unveiling the real situation of human rights in the United States of America, the situation deteriorates with every year, which is evidenced by numerous reports of the State Council of the Chinese Republic, by numbers, by facts. And of course, official mass media don't dare to do it, but we can still see the real image of what is going on. And the situation causes a great concern among the international community. It remains in the center of the critics of profile international structures, non-governmental organizations, where they're allowed to do it, of course. Where after such criticism, the United States don't impose sanctions or don't include these experts in the stop lists, where anyone who dared to present facts. As for ourselves, we studied the report, and these problem with human rights truly poses obstacles to the efforts of the international community to truly preserve human rights and ensure the freedoms of everyone. And some of these problems were published in April in the report of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia on the situation of human rights in the United States of America. And Washington claims to try to preserve the principle of universal human rights and freedoms, and they try to play the part of the pioneer of human rights on the international arena while fully ignoring the existing problems in their own country, which fully contradicts their ambitions in their area. United States interfere with internal affairs of other states under the pretext of solving the human rights situation, but in reality, they're only contributing to the self-destruction of numerous states, which we've also mentioned numerous times. And the situation in Ukraine is one of the clearest examples of that, proving this.
Holding various military operations on the territory of European countries, creation, and by the way of secret prisons, flying prisons, rigid migration policy, illogical migration policy that contradicts to law, to statements, that is chaotic in terms of implementations, violations of human rights. See the duality of U.S. standards to human rights, as well as its approach to international law in general. Uncontrollable power in the world. The United States can act in those areas where they know they won't be fought back. They feel that they are allowed to do everything. That's what their exceptionalism is about. They're using information, financial resources, and mechanisms. U.S. authorities are actively using the tactic of waging a proxy war against, for example, our country and our people. They are pressuring NATO allies to make similar decisions to help Kiev. They are using human rights mechanisms, and they create a negative image of our country, negative image of our allies and partners at the global stage. One of the major issues to countering challenges that today's international community is facing with in terms of human rights is the use of double standards by Washington in evaluating any situation or phenomena. There is a lack, even the absence of double standards. Today, the United States are dispersing protests, pro-Palestinian protests, go against all the statements of State Department, which calls on other countries to give an opportunity to civilians to express their will and to exercise their freedom of expression. Such approach is hypocritically being used by the United States to intervene in domestic affairs of other states. The facts are showing that the United States have been violating fundamental human rights and freedoms in the Middle East. They have caused irreparable damage and irretrievable losses to countries and to peoples. The nature of the American hegemonism, their policy, might is right, makes their understanding of democracy a watered down and illogical concept, that it contradicts universal values, that is aimed at building rules-based world order that serves the narrow interests of Washington. Their commitment to the distorted understanding of sovereignty and their distorted understanding of UN Charter principles, which is non-interference in domestic affairs. That's what make other countries to be disillusioned with Western values, because these very same values have caused a lot of problems for so many countries. We believe that actions from Washington, like waging wars, mass killings of civilians, setting civilizations against one another, imprisonments, tortures, violations of international law are unacceptable. These violations should be legally evaluated, and they should be covered by mass media. Thank you. And the second question, the governments of Norway, Spain, and the Netherlands have recognized Palestine as an independent state on May 28th. The President of the European Council, Charles Michel, also voiced his support in recognizing the state of Palestine. He believed that the recognition of the state of Palestine should become, for the EU, a way to require important steps in the area of reforms. But I think we have provided all the information to you, the last briefing. Next question, please. Over the past year, in Russia, there was so many scandalous incidents with the American citizens, including representatives of the American diplomatic missions, like drinking brawls, even theft, resisting arrest. How can we qualify it when Americans who believe in their exceptionalists behave like that? And how do American authorities behave after such situations with their citizens? You know, I'll give you one example. I think it happened in 2005 or 2006, when Americans have made up a story in New York that a Russian diplomat, an official of the Russian permanent mission to the United Nations, he didn't beat, he didn't knock down, but this person touched a police officer when he exited his vehicle. There were protests outside our embassy, we have received so many letters from senators and lawmakers demanding to deprive this diplomat of the immunities. Nothing happened actually. The car of this diplomat was illegally stopped, and after taking this diplomat to the police station, they realized that they violated the Vienna Convention on diplomatic relations, and they decided to make up this story. Unfortunately, mass media have circulated a made-up version of the story. They have copied statements made by the American officials. Several weeks later, it became known that in one of the countries, an American diplomat, a representative of the diplomatic mission, has crashed into the motorcade of local authorities. And I believe that Americans made up the story about the Russian diplomat so that they could shift the focus from their diplomat who committed a serious offense. Well, we are people and we can make mistakes. Americans, but we should also talk about Anglo-Saxons. Americans, they don't respect the point of view of other people apart from their own objectives, goals, and narrow interests. They act as they see fit. And when they are presented with the facts and numbers about the misconduct of their diplomats, they do not draw any conclusions. They start launching campaigns to disavow and to create a smokescreen to disguise this story, or they are making up stories quite in a ridiculous way so that they could get away with what they've done. We have witnessed that so many times. We understand that it is beneficial to them, but the statistics, as for the arrest of foreigners, if they commit offenses in our country, it is up to the Ministry of Interior. We remember that in 2021, an American diplomat, he stole a part of the railway infrastructure. And there was another story when another American diplomat stole personal belongings of another person. I understand that there are different situations. Again, we're all people. Different things might happen, and when you are present and when you're working in another state, so many things might happen to you if you're a diplomat. But you might become a victim of circumstances. You might become a victim of your own problems. But the question is how you respond to that. You might admit your faults, respect the law, and observe the Vienna Convention, or you can disrespect everything that I've mentioned, and they call this because you believe that you're exceptional. Thank you. Do you have any more questions? No? Okay, Reuter, please. Hello, Ms. Zakharova. We have two questions for you. The first is the statement of the Deputy National Security Advisor, Dalip Singh. He stated in the Tuesday's evening that Washington and his partners are ready to use sanctions and export control instruments to hinder the trade between China and Russia in goods and technologies that present a threat to the security of the United States and their NATO allies. He also threatened to take measures against what Americans call a shadow fleet that is shipping oil in order to evade oil price cap. What's the opinion of the Russian Foreign Ministry of these statements, and what Russia should do to prevent U.S. interference in Russia-China relations? We can qualify it in different ways. It depends on the tactics, goals, objectives, what steps are taken by the collective West. They are not alone in their actions. They are trying to make their allies to act in the same way, in particular NATO allies. We view it as an interference in trade and economic ties between two sovereign states. They are also trying to compensate their economic failures. They are trying to make up for what they missed, for the areas where they are lagging behind because of that illegitimate tactics that they're using. Again, we can qualify it as a trade war, as a part of the hybrid warfare launched against our country and other countries. We could call it as a deterrence policy and a policy to inflict a strategic defeat in our country. There are so many words and phrases how we can call it. So we have no problems with terminology, but the whole world is facing problems with the disruption of economic and commercial ties. We believe that U.S. sanctions will result in the fact that the international community will stop using the Western logistical infrastructure. The use of unilateral, illegitimate sanctions against our country won't make our country to renounce mutually beneficial cooperation with China that observes to the full extent international law. Actually, it is applicable to all countries that are ready to develop cooperation with our country. But since you mentioned China, I've mentioned China. As for the functioning of world energy markets, we condemn oil price caps, restrictions on oil deliveries and oil supplies, any attempts to create cartels of buyers, and as well as their request to reduce the price, that the price will be dictated not by the demand and supply, but the price will be dictated by the buyers, the cartel of buyers. Such unfair and illegitimate practices have a negative effect on the international energy corporations that have been brewing for years. It makes energy resources more expensive, and it leads to the degradation of the global security system, including the energy security, and responsible actors of international relations have to counteract such measures. We are ready to work with like-minded countries in bilateral and multilateral formats. Since, well, I've noted today the Eurasian Economic Union, the countries of the global south are happy to work with us, and they have to take into account the current realities, and therefore the United States are saying that they are going to go extra mile to prevent Russia from developing cooperation. They are ready to create competitive advantages for them, and they are ready to push Russia out of the market. What we're going to do, Russia is consistent in its actions. We are ready to maintain the global energy security for the interests of developing states on a basis of international law and mutual respect, and Now we have to disavow the lies of global leaders that Russia is not supplying the adequate amount of energy resources to the Western markets. That's official London just said, it's not true. We're supplying energy resources to those who are ready to work with us and who are ready to make agreements with us with regard to the price of supplies. We haven't stopped any supplies for political motives. For us, these are market relations. These are relations of mutually acceptable trade and economic interaction, benefit, financial and economic benefit. And the West has tried to get rid of that. It tried to control it. And after it failed, it just get rid of the opportunity to acquire our energy resources. I'm referring to the European Union that has become a victim of the US policy in this direction. We have been developing sustained contacts and ties. We have been developing the relevant infrastructure, but we have heard that the United States called on the European partners not to acquire Russian energy resources, not to develop interaction, not to build and develop the corresponding projects. And after they failed to discourage the EU and to intimidate the EU, so let's say directly, they detonated Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. These are the statements that were made by Joe Biden and Victoria Nuland that give evidence to that. Investigation is underway. The countries of Northern Europe